Hi, so I'm Patrick Lamson-Hall from Startup Societies Foundation, and I'm here today talking to Michael Castle-Miller, the head of Politas Consulting and Politas Labs. Um, and we're going to talk today about Georgism, or land value taxation, as it's sometimes called. And this is something that Michael has worked a lot on, that Michael and I have worked together on, and it's a hot topic. People are very curious about it. A lot of people have a lot of ideas about it, and hopefully we can establish somewhat what the relationship is to charter cities and startup societies, and see if this is something that's actually useful, and maybe also have an interesting conversation, right? So I don't know, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and just tell a little bit about your background before we jump into the exciting world of Henry George?
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on. Um, it's great to talk about this because I've kind of my specialization has been in advising on the institutional frameworks and the laws and the policies for special jurisdictions. So that could include charter cities and more traditional special economic zones. And I'm a big believer in using zones as sort of pilots for good reforms that a country should adopt. And one idea that I stumbled across a few years ago was the idea of land value taxation, or generally collecting the value of land as it appreciates in an area and using it for the benefit of society, paying for infrastructure and public services, as well as things that sustain a thriving economy and society and environment in the place. And the number one barrier that I think to implementing this type of policy, the land value tax type policy, is the fact that usually you're dealing with a jurisdiction where there's already a bunch of people living there, and they've all already got ownership of their little plots of land. So coming in with some charge on the value of land is extremely difficult politically. So you've got a problem of like status quo bias, of entrenched interest trying to not wanting to be charged for something they already get for free.
Let's slow down a
Yeah,
little before we get into the obstacles. Let's define the nouns before we get to the verbs. So
I'm so glad you did that. But let me just sorry. Let me just summarize by saying this: the reason why I thought is why I think the merger of land value tax and special jurisdictions is so key, because special jurisdictions present us with the opportunity to implement good policy that's not possible anywhere else. And so
so
that's why I'm a big believer in like using land value type taxation and with a special jurisdiction.
yeah, it makes good sense to me. I mean, I think that there are a huge opportunity for a lot of common sense reforms and piloting those reforms. And especially when it comes to taxation, there's often a huge amount of reluctance. As you're saying, there's a huge bias toward the status quo because people's whole economic models for their business or for their household are bound up in the tax system working a certain way.
Right.
But maybe you could start by just clarifying for our, I'm not going to say our listeners, but let's say our listener, for clarifying for our listener, what the difference is between a land value tax and a property tax. And just for the sake of argument, let's also distinguish it from just rent, like just collecting rent on a piece of land or having a lease. Like
Yeah.
what's the big difference here? Like why
Yeah.
is this a better idea, and what do we do now?
I really appreciate your pessimism, or you could say realism. Okay, so one viewer out there, here's the description of the difference between a land value tax and a property
I
tax.
know Joseph McKinney is going to watch it. No,
Okay,
well,
Joe.
I know that I've
I'll
got at
just
least,
talk. I'll
I've
just
got
talk to
one.
Joe.
No matter what happens, I won't be disappointed.
Okay, Joe, and if we're lucky, one or two other people.
Let's say.
So a property tax that you'd normally pay is charged on both the value of the land and all the stuff that's built on top of the land. So if you think of your house, if you own if you're lucky enough to own a house, I don't own a house, but if you own a house, you in most Western countries, like the U.S., you own both the land and you own the structure on top of it, your house. And both of those are valued together. So the value of both the land and the structure are combined for the purposes of a property tax assessment by some city government official who comes through, who's known as an assessor, and then they figure out what the value is. And the property tax, so the property tax is charging like 1 or 2% of annually of the value of both the house and the land underneath. A land value tax basically removes the tax on the built portion of the property so that you're just calculating the value of the land itself without counting the value of the house. And that's what's taxed for purposes of a land value tax.
And the logic behind this, if I understand it correctly, is like we all know from Econ 101 that a tax discourages behavior, right? So if you put a tax on something, it makes it more expensive to do, and therefore people do less of it. It moves the demand curve, right? So if you put a tax on property, for example, people want to develop less of it. People want to build fewer buildings if you're taxing buildings. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. There's innumerable reasons why this is a good idea, which we can unpack. But one of them is every time you tax something, you discourage it, and you're discouraging productive activity. And if you're taxing something that's productive, you're discouraging a productive activity. And building things, building houses and buildings and office complexes and things is productive activity. You're contributing to the economy. You're doing something useful. And so if you tax the value of that, then you're disincentivizing building. The interesting thing about land is nobody builds it. It's just there, given to us by God or nature. And so taxing it is a little bit different.
So this is the insight that Henry George had is if you discourage people from doing something like building a building or making a pair of shoes, they'll do less of it. But when it comes to land, they occupy and use the amount of land that they occupy and use. They can't move that activity somewhere else because land is fixed in place.
That's right. Yeah, you can't, if you tax it, that's another great thing is oftentimes when you tax something, whatever it is that you're taxing tends to run away. If you're taxing, incomes or something, people try to find a way of moving their incomes to some other jurisdiction where it can't be found. Or sometimes you tax something, you get less of that thing that you're taxing, less productivity that you're taxing. If you tax wages, you have an impact on job growth and rising wages. But with land doesn't run away. It can't go away. So you could actually, what Henry George observed, and the French physiocrats before him and many others, is that you could actually tax land up to 100% of its value and with no loss in certainly economic productivity and no loss in land because land doesn't go anywhere.
Interesting. So it seems like an idea that it's not intuitive, but once you get it, it's intuitive, right? So the idea of separating, as my cable company calls it, like unbundling any taxes that you might want to put onto property and improvements from any taxes that you might want to put on the underlying land. But this idea has encountered some obstacles, right? I mean, it had a lot of adherence in the early part of the 20th century, and then it kind of went underground for a while. Can you tell a little bit about like what has maybe prevented this from being taken up more widely, other than just inertia? I mean, what are the challenges here?
Yeah, so in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this was kind of like the great progressive social reform that was being pushed. And Henry George was the big champion of it at that time, because there was a lot of frustration during that time, as you may remember from history. There was the perception that there were a lot of kind of very wealthy elites who were profiting hugely, sometimes from doing economically productive activities, but many times by not doing anything really economically productive, through, for instance, having a monopoly on something, or monopsony or some type of limiting competition against yourself, and making money in other ways that weren't economically productive. In economic terms, that's known as rents, economic rents. And what people like Henry George and some other great economists were always observing is that one way in which economic rents are generated, in other words, unearned income, especially by the wealthiest people in society at that time, was through land value going up. In other words,
kind of, or
what's that?
Kind of like through speculation.
Yeah, so speculation is kind of like the starkest example, but it happens all the time, in any type of land ownership situation. But in speculate, especially what Henry George observed with the westward expansion in the United States, when European descendants started settling the American West in the great settler colonialism period of American history. Lots of people were going out there, staking their claim to a huge tract of land out in the American West and kind of sitting on it, not really doing anything productive with it. And 10, 20, 30 years later, it becomes extraordinarily valuable because industrialists built all these railroads going out there, and there's a lot more mobility and people surging out there. So demand for land went way up. And so then those people could sell it at a huge increase in value. And so this became like a really stark example of how people, just by kind of getting there first and laying their claim to it, could generate a tremendous amount of income without doing anything productive in economic
They've
terms.
done nothing other than hold the rights to
Right.
that. So that's all that they've done. And everything that added the value, it sounds like you're saying, was added by other people.
Right. And which actually happens in almost all the time, not just in these like really clear examples of speculation. That's just when it's most obvious.
We've talked about this previously, like what makes a piece of land valuable is like access, proximity. And
right.
These things are like two things going on. One is like you need the public goods that bring connectivity to a piece of land, right? Land that doesn't have any connection usually has very low value. And
right.
then private amenities crowd in and also contribute to the value of that land. But you yourself aren't really doing anything. Like you can leave the land bare and a bunch of people invest around you and your land becomes more valuable because it's a better place to be, even though you yourself didn't do anything.
Yes, that's right. And this is true in almost every case in which land value rises in a society. The key kind of insight of people like Henry George and the other reformers part of his movement is that land value is almost never created by the person occupying that parcel of land. And this is huge.
It's not even possible for it to be like, because the value of land is like a collective thing, right?
Right. Land value rises when the society around you gives the land value, which by raising demand there. And so that's created by all of the economic activity happening around you that creates jobs, for instance, and workers are trying to move into the area or start businesses in the area. That drives up land value. Infrastructure, roads and subway systems and all of this, and power connections. The overall attractiveness of an area, how if there's great parks, if it's beautiful, it's a nice place to live. All these things are places that increase demand for a particular plot of land, and that raises its value. There's exceptions to this, though, that should be noted, and some people kind of point this out, like major real estate development projects. Disney World is a great example, right? I can't argue that the Walt Disney World Corporation didn't create the land value in and around Disney World.
Right. And maybe also like some special jurisdictions, like in a charter city where someone decides to do a complete master plan, like the Morzon project, for example, where the master plan is complete, the infrastructure is brought in, this, that, and the other. Like, yeah, you can definitely have that, but it sounds like that's the exception.
Right. It's like your individual kind of landowner that just owns a plot of land is almost never giving that land its value. And if they do, it's a very, very small, normally a very small percentage of its value is created by the landowner, him or herself.
Interesting. Interesting. So it sounds like there's partly a practical argument here, which is that like why should people be benefiting from something that they're not creating, like that rewards people in a way that we don't want them to be rewarded, right? It rewards them for an activity that we don't want, which is owning land and not using it, and it rewards them for doing very little. Then there's there's also a more pragmatic consideration, which is like if the benefits of the increase in land value are accruing to that landowner, but they're not doing anything that's contributing to it, then in a way you make it harder to get into like a virtuous cycle of development, right?
Right. And I want to go back to what you were originally talking about with the history of this in the early 20th century, because this, for exactly the reasons you just mentioned, this became like a major kind of progressive social reform. And it got kind of hijacked through because as soon as Henry George was out there saying all of these landowners out there, the vast majority of them are already extremely wealthy, have a large portion of their money is acquired unjustly because they're taking what society created, the value society gave to their land, and they're keeping it for themselves only. And so that's why the extreme rich are so rich and why everybody else is so poor. That's what he's pointing out. But the problem is that a lot of those very wealthy people didn't realize the threat that they were under, that they could no longer collect all of these economic rents for themselves. And so I think the progressive movement it kind of veered off into other forms of wealth redistribution. So we had the introduction of the income tax and the scaling up of the income tax, because it became much more attractive to wealthy elites to have the government tax incomes rather than taxing the value of land.
Because taxing the value of land is actually a wealth tax.
That's right. That's right. It's a wealth tax, and it's the one. I think one of the large. I think Piketty points this out, where like one of the largest kind of stores of wealth in America, especially right now, is in land, or it's in real estate, and a large portion of that is in land value.
Sure, absolutely. So, but some places do have this. Some people have been able to get this through. A lot of them, it was legacy. Could you tell us about an example of a place that has this, a contemporary one or a historical one? I know that that's not your area, like you're not a historian, but it would be good to know like some place actually does this.
Yeah, this actually, land taxes actually became the dominant form of collecting public revenue into the kind of pre-modern period, into the one of the earliest forms of taxation, all the way through until like the mid 1800s in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. Because I think there was this realization, especially coming out of ancient times in the medieval era, that land is not really something that is a private commodity. And indigenous cultures still embrace this really strongly, that there's this intuition that people had that land value isn't, what we now know from economics, that land value isn't created by the individual landowner, it's created by society, or it's created by the earth. And so it makes sense that if you're going to collect public revenue from something, you should collect it from the people who are profiting from the plot of the earth that they're taking up, the share of the commons that they're taking up. And so you should use that to fund public services. And then late 1800s, 1900s, and on to today, we veered off course, and we primarily taxed corporate incomes and individual incomes. And property taxes amount to some, but it's taxed on improvements, as we said. But there are a lot of places in the world that still use effectively a land value tax really effectively. A lot of East Asian countries use this model quite a bit. The one that probably does it the best, to my knowledge, is Hong Kong, where the government owns all of the land in Hong Kong, and then leases it out, grants the ground leases to individual people or businesses that that lease it from the government and pay a rental price for the land. And it's priced at about the full market value of the plot of land. It's effectively 100% of land value tax. This does great things because it incentivizes all sorts of good things. Incentivizes density, because you're not going to sit on a plot of land where you're paying the full value of that parcel of land and not use it to its highest and best use. So you're going to build up, you're going to do as many productive activities with that parcel of land as you can. It also creates a revenue stream from the land into government to pay for the infrastructure and services that then give that land more value. And so as better infrastructure and services raise the land value, the government gets more money, which creates more money for good infrastructure and services. So you have this endless virtuous cycle. And that's probably one of the reasons why the Hong Kong Metropolitan Transit Authority is one of the best funded, most profitable metro systems in the world, because a large portion of their revenue comes from the land leases right around the major metro stops that they service. So the better services they provide, the more the value of those parcels go up, which increases their revenue, which they can then fund better transportation services with.
So it sets up like in a certain type of, I don't know, in development economics, they call it like a development state, right? But like this is like a development city. So
right.
In a city that's interested in doing development, that's interested in having strong public goods that increase land value and seeing more productive activity, a land value tax can put the incentives in the right place for that. I mean, I can imagine, not to be difficult, but I could imagine a scenario where they have a land value tax and they use it as a great opportunity to like steal the revenues or something like that. Not in Hong Kong, obviously, but in a development state context where that's really the goal, it gives you the public sector revenues that you need to make the necessary investments.
That's right. And I've heard I think the Belt and Road Initiative basically is using the same model of land value capture. So the Chinese do it quite a bit, and which makes sense because it not only it gives you this self-sustaining source of revenue to pay for the infrastructure, but it also aligns the incentive with good service provision too.
Right.
And I think that's really crucial because I think we're moving into an era where we have to find ways of linking public interests with private interests, where the profit motive is aligned with overall social good. And I think that's one thing that this model does really well.
And it also ties us in really nicely to special jurisdictions, especially the more urban types of special jurisdictions, because those are almost by definition on the development state model, right? I mean, nobody sets up a charter city because they are interested in not having development.
Right.
So could you tell a little bit about how you see land value taxes fitting into this special jurisdiction model?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one approach is not really charging it as a tax, not considering it a tax at all, but doing essentially what Hong Kong does and other places do, where the administrator of the charter city, of the special jurisdiction, has either ownership of the land or has a lease on the land from government that they then sublease out to the individual individual occupants of the city, and in exchange for charging the rental value of that parcel of land that they're using. And in that way, it's not really a tax that you're charging at all. It's just people paying the rental value of the land. In other words, the value of the slice of the commons has been allotted to them. And that's now, and I think really that the nice thing about that is it captures well a kind of a fundamental issue with the land value tax, in that calling it a tax, I feel uncomfortable calling a land value tax a tax to begin with, because it's not really a tax.
It's a rent.
It's a charge that for something that, for using something that society creates. Society gives land value. You're benefiting from that by occupying this particular parcel of land. So you're paying for the right to use to sit on that parcel of land.
And
This is the same model, the same idea, by the way, for a quote unquote carbon tax. And there's a lot of people wisely and appropriately using the term like carbon pricing instead, because that's a more or charges for the use of for emitting things into the atmosphere, because it's coming from this fundamental intuition that you're not being taxed on something that you're doing productively. You're being charged for something you're using, that you're taking from the commons. And
it's a different framing on
same thing with land.
Yeah, it's like a different framing on the source of value, right?
Right.
Yeah. So when we think about it like that, it has interesting. I don't want this podcast to be too long, so that's why I'm kind of moving things along.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It has interesting implications when we think about it like that for how you assess it, right? Because you mentioned earlier that like you could tax land value at 100% of the value of the land, amortized, I guess, in some way, but like you can tax it at 100%. Most things you cannot tax at 100%. You can't even come close to taxing it at 100% of the value. I mean, I live in New Jersey. My property taxes are like ruinously high, and I still think that they're only taxing us at about like 50% or something like that. I mean, it's not a 50% taxation rate, but like amortized over the amount of time it takes to pay back a mortgage on the house, like it's still not even close to 100%, right?
Right.
But I also understand that assessment is one of the challenges involved in land value taxation. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that. I mean, how do you know what the value of a piece of land is?
Yeah, now we're getting into territory where you're hiding your knowledge, Patrick. Because
I'm trying to elicit knowledge.
Okay, good. Bringing out some things you taught me actually about this. So, so what we're charging is not really like the full we're charging the full value of a parcel of land amortized. Essentially, like you're taking the annual rental value of that parcel of land, or like the value that it is, that the value of being able to occupy and use a parcel of land for a month or a year or whatever it is. That's the amount of money that they're paying. And I think there's some really interesting models for doing this. Now, there's sort of like more traditional like assessment models that are used, for instance, when you calculate a property tax right now, where you're looking at, you have like an assessor who goes there and applies some methodology where they look at the value of comparable parcels of property that have been exchanged, and they calculate the value of land by maybe subtracting the value of the buildings from whatever the sale price was or something. So there's and I think there's some great models. There's a guy, I wish I could give him credit right now, but his name is escaping me. But I was just reading his paper where he's got like 8 different ways of calculating value, and he's a property tax assessor of just calculating land value as distinct from value of properties. But you could probably look at Pennsylvania had a split rate tax, and you could look at their model for doing it. But I think there's some really interesting models that like a charter city could apply that are different from just having an independent assessor, where you could really use like a self-assessment model of the value of the property. So say, for instance, you have an auction. So you've got a big block of a subdivision and a number of parcels of land you could put it up for an auction where people are essentially bidding on a certain schedule of payments that they'll pay over a 20 or 30-year lease for that parcel. And so you've got, bidder A saying, I'll pay $100 for this parcel in years 1 through 3, and then 200 in years 4 through 5, and so on. And then whoever the highest bidder is, whoever's willing to pay the most in terms of net present value of that bid schedule, they would win it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really interesting model, but it seems like it would introduce, I think we've argued about this, it would introduce some uncertainty for the people who were using the land currently, right?
Yeah. So, well, if you've already got, so let's say you could start from like kind of stage 1 where there's nobody on the land, and this charter city developer has issues like a 20 or 30-year lease to the highest bidder. And then at the end of those 20 or 30 years, yeah, you've got a problem where, let's say somebody's built a house there, or they built structures and everything there. And then are you going to have a new auction where they might be outbid?
Yeah.
And essentially what you're talking about in that situation is where the current occupant can no longer afford the rental value of the parcel that they're occupying at that time, after the 20 or 30 years, right? Because the auction determines whatever the market value of that land is. So there's competing concerns here where you don't want to overly favor the existing occupant, because then you're going to get into a situation of rent seeking, or exactly like we have right now with most property, where current occupants are collecting or essentially taking the value, the rental value of the land for themselves, rather than paying it in the form of a land value tax or rental price or something. But but I think one approach you could take is you say, okay, you have a new auction, the current occupant can bid in that auction. They maybe get a 10% discount off of whatever the highest bid price is, so they get a little nudge in their favor. And then if they don't end up winning the auction, they have to, the new occupant has to pay for the value of the improvements that they built there. So they're essentially getting bought out of all the improvements. You could also find ways of accommodating both people. Ideally, the city would be trying to increase density as much as possible. So rather than a single family dwelling, they could have a 10-unit dwelling built there, and then the existing occupant takes ownership over a condo there on the land.
Yeah, 2 to 3 apartments, even if they really needed to be compensated. My understanding, and maybe just a nice note to move things forward on, is you are actively trying to promote this in some places. This is like what's amazing about your situation, is that you literally get to go into different jurisdictions and tell them, in a loud, clear voice, I think that this is a good idea. Can you please give me a little bit of land to try it on, or fit it into projects? And I was wondering if you could just, I know that you're tightly wrapped in confidentiality agreements, but if you could just tell us a little bit about what that's like what you're up to now, and if you could, like, what those conversations are like.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like I was saying, like this kind of model is like virtually impossible. If I were to go to the city of LA and say you should start collecting 100% of the value of land, if you were to go to New York, do that, there's no way, because land ownership is so widely distributed. So the number of people you're screwing is like 70% of the voting population.
Right. Or the way that I think of that is, like, everybody has, for every investment that people make, they have a spreadsheet, right? And there's a way that the spreadsheet works that says, I make money on this investment. And one of the things that's on the spreadsheet is the taxes.
That's right.
So you change it, you screw up people's spreadsheet.
Right. And now keep in mind that you're taking away from people what they didn't earn in the first place, but they're used to keeping what they didn't earn. So we can't take back what the thief has stolen in most jurisdictions. So what we do instead is we take like a new development where land is unoccupied. If it is occupied, you can have the already inhabitants become shareholders in the company that is responsible for the development of this charter city. So they're essentially collected, a portion of the land value increase is going to the initial occupants. There's tons of models that could be developed that way. But so we're doing this from a range of types of places, where one is from the Pacific Island nation of Vanuatu, which Patrick is very familiar with too.
I love Vanuatu. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful place.
We both spent some time out there, and in a situation where of indigenous, where all the land is owned by indigenous tribes that own the land under the rules of custom, which are usually that the tribe owns the land in common, or they have a special way of kind of allocating land rights, but they effectively prohibit the land from ever being permanently transferred or permanently sold to another party. We can only lease the land. So we're creating a model that plugs into that respects indigenous owners' rights to land, and essentially a model of land ownership that I think is rooted in a lot of justice too. And so preserving that, and then all the way from indigenous cultures through models whereby existing cities can create special development zones, like Patrick, you and I proposed in the Housing Cities model, where you can develop, a city can develop a special corporation that's responsible for developing and changing the zoning laws over a particular area of land in a city, and then collecting the increase in land value that rises, that comes from that new development, all the way up out of the earth to the moon, with a concept that I'm working on with some space experts called the Lunar Development Cooperative, which is a model that adjusts the fact that under the existing space treaties, it's really impossible for anybody to own land on the moon legally.
It's governed by Antarctica, right? That's what you were telling me.
Yeah, a little bit. It's it's a kind of a murky legal question of whether a nation or a private individual can own land on the moon, and it's so murky that it's better to just sort of avoid it. And so we created a model that is where no one would own the value of land, but you'd have a service provider called the Lunar Development Cooperative that would build infrastructure and provide services to support lunar development. And then in exchange for the right to access their services, people pay effectively for the value of the spot of the moon that they are occupying and using during that period.
So it would be, what I love about that idea, aside from obviously that it's very fun to think about, and like having brainstormed on that with you, I think was extremely entertaining and excellent, is this idea that like you would think that it would start with the infrastructure, right? If you want to develop the moon, if you want to develop rural Vanuatu, which can be probably actually takes slightly longer to get to than the moon in some cases, like, I mean, coming from New York, I think
it might be with the layovers.
Days, right? Yeah. So
it's
with
brutal.
the layovers, it's comparably distant to the moon.
Yeah.
You think that you start with the infrastructure, but where you really have to start is with the system, right? You have to start with like, what's the governance going to be? How are we going to actually capture value from this? How are we going to set that up? And this is what I love about like working with you and talking to you, Michael, is like, you understand that what makes it work or not work is the stuff that you don't see. Like it never, you don't get there by putting stakes in the ground or by paving roads. You get there by setting up a framework, the rules of the game, the software that actually lets it unspool. And I think that this is a really important perspective, especially in the charter cities space or the startup society space, which says like, look, you might have a vision, a beautiful master plan, but unless you have the right rules of the game, this is always just going to be a plan. It's never going to become something that's dynamic.
Yeah.
And you tell about it. I just got excited.
No, yeah, thanks. I totally agree. It's all about institutions. That's what that's kind of like the modern trend in development economics too, I think, is is a focus on the role of institutions in creating economic development. The rules of the game are far more important than just about every other thing we try to tinker with in development. Maybe a close second is education, investments in education. But if you change the rules, you can do things like, fix problems with the main barrier to developing good space infrastructure to support development of the moon is it's extraordinarily expensive. Billions and billions, trillions of dollars to build good infrastructure, especially under current models. So, but the only way I think that we have a chance of recouping the investment in infrastructure is through a model like this, where all of the value that's created by the infrastructure is ordinarily externalized onto the commons, onto land and onto locations. If we can internalize that value, then we actually have a revenue stream that'll be large enough and that scales with the pace of development, so that we can actually deliver a return on investment in space infrastructure.
Amazing.
And I think the same model is anywhere where it's hard to fund, to have like a self-sustaining model for funding infrastructure or services or good governance in an area. This is like the key model for making it happen.
Amazing. I love it. Michael, thank you so much for your time. It's really great
Yeah.
speaking to you. And I'll talk to you more soon, I hope.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Good. Take care.
See ya.